welcome everyone. As folks are starting to trickle in, we are so excited to start the first of our media series at the Housing Narrative Lab, and so excited to have two great friends joining us to talk a little bit about anti-racism and how to be anti-racist in housing and homelessness coverage. My name is Marisol Bello, and I'm the director of the Housing Narrative Lab. And the Housing Narrative Lab is a new organization of researchers and communications professionals. And we're focused really on what is the story, the reality, right, of who experiences homelessness and why. We know that there's a very particular lens and frame around the folks that are experiencing homelessness, and those of us that are working in this space also know that that lens is not as broad as it needs to be, particularly around the root causes of who and why are experiencing, the folks that are experiencing homelessness. And so we are really looking at how to move conversations so that we can talk about how safe and affordable housing is the first step towards stability and opportunity for everyone, so that you can start to build a healthy and thriving life. And so we wanted to do our first media series. Part of the work that we do at the Housing Narrative Lab is looking at education and training, helping folks to understand the true nature of homelessness, looking again at the systemic issues that are at play here. And one of the key ones, frankly, is race and racism, and a very long history of exclusionary housing policies in this country that have disproportionately affected people of color. So we know that homelessness is a racial justice issue. So today's webinar is really about how is anti-racism in their coverage of housing instability and homelessness. And we are so super lucky to have two amazing folks joining us today who will discuss what it means to be anti-racist in coverage. First, I want to join a very longtime friend and colleague, Yvonne Latty, who is a veteran journalist and author, filmmaker, podcaster, professor, and all the wonderful things. She recently was at the Arthur Carter Journalism Institute at New York University, both of our alma mater, and soon is going to be the director of the New Logan Center for Urban Investigative Reporting at Temple University in Philly. And Saba is the managing director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute at the University of Southern California. The center is the institute is a collaborative of more than 100 researchers, policymakers, and people with lived experience in homelessness, who promote equitable and culturally informed solutions to homelessness in Los Angeles County, where we know clearly housing is a considerable issue. She has really deep experience spearheading projects across the country that measure and investigate and enforce equal access to housing based on multiple protected classes. So in this webinar, we're going to address how societal biases about homelessness impact news coverage and identify the root causes of homelessness that disproportionately impact people of color. We want you as journalists and as storytellers and those working in this space to walk away from the next hour with concrete steps that you can take to be anti-racist and write and cover in anti-racist ways in terms of your housing and your homelessness coverage. We're going to do our best to answer all of your questions. We're going to kick off with a few questions here, but we're going to do our best to answer your questions. So you can include your questions in the Q&A box, which my colleagues, Natalie Fani-Gonzalez and Claire Sloss, will be monitoring. And we're gonna, when we start with the Q&A, we'll start with the questions that were submitted during the registration process. So first, Saba and Yvonne, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought we would just jump in. What does it mean to be anti-racist when covering housing and homelessness? And if you also wanna throw in an introduction by way of kicking off, please do. We'll start maybe Saba, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I just want to say it's just such an honor to be here on the Housing Narratives Lab's very first webinar. I just feel so honored, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do. And I also want to acknowledge the land on which I'm standing. I am hailing from Tongva land that was unceded territory inhabited by the Tongva and Gabrielino people, otherwise known as Los Angeles, California. And I just want to acknowledge our American Indian, African American, Latinx, and Asian American ancestors, and all of the ancestors represented on this call, and everyone in the audience. So I honor you, and I welcome the presence of the wisdom of our ancestors. And yeah, I mean, it's a big question that you ask, Marisol, and thank you for it. What does it mean to be anti-racist when covering housing and homelessness? You know, I think the place that I'd like to start is just to say that, you know, the coverage recognizes the impact of historic and current institutionalized oppression, rather than placing blame on Black or brown bodies. Understanding that we have in the United States a legacy of racialized poverty that that has been grounded in white supremacy culture. And one of the kind of mechanisms of that culture is placing blame in a very individualistic way on Black and brown bodies. And so I think coverage that acknowledges that we're swimming in that, our systems are swimming in white supremacy, and that we, instead of thinking about what people did and did not do, acknowledge the force of those systems that have been intergenerational. And I think also on the same token, and this is sort of like tricky, is that we acknowledge that there is disproportionate representation of Black and brown people in the population across the country of people experiencing homelessness. In fact, in every state in our nation, Black people are overrepresented in homeless populations, and that's a piece of data that I got from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So I think on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the force of white supremacy on the systems and causing the disproportionality. And on the other hand, we can't take a colorblind approach. We have to acknowledge that housing is a racial justice issue, essentially. And so that, you know, holding those two things that seem like they're opposing but are not, I think is something that, you know, is a sort of a tricky thing to tread, but very important, because we need to think about housing as a racial justice issue in order to be able to address the racial disparities. And then lastly, I'll say that the coverage, anti-racist coverage, should amplify the stories and voices of Black, Indigenous people of color. You know, every story about homelessness, in my hope when I'm reading, will amplify the voice of someone that's experienced it, and hopefully have a representative voice. Here in Los Angeles, not only are Black, Indigenous people of color overrepresented, but they also make up the majority of people experiencing homelessness. And so this is a Black and brown, you know, Black and brown communities are really suffering with the experience of housing precarity and homelessness. And so and that marginalization, that intergenerational marginalization, can be countered in big and small ways. And I think one of the ways is to, at the very least, have those voices represented and seen in your coverage.
Saba, thank you. Thank you for that, because it's so important. So much of your work has revolved around equitable system. So you are really looking at this from the place of the research that you've done, and certainly living in a community where so much of this plays out. So I really, really appreciate sort of that scene setting. And I'm curious, Yvonne, if you could kind of jump in a little from the reporter perspective, because one of the things that kind of jumped up at me as Saba was mentioning this is like, as a reporter, it's there are a lot of pieces, right, that you want to really kind of hold and write about. And sometimes when we're just being logistical, you have to do it in 2 hours with 500 words, or a 1 minute, you know, piece. And so maybe Yvonne, you could talk a little bit about, I could see a reporter going, huh? That's a lot. That's a lot, right? And
Sure.
I would
Yeah.
love to kind of figure out, Yvonne, if you could talk a little bit about how reporters can kind of, use some of what Saba is saying in the reality of their day to day.
I guess the truth of the matter is most of us, especially reporters of color, aren't lucky enough to have weeks, months, and years to work on one story and follow a family around or do deep dives. A lot of times we're reacting to the news. So we come into work, our editor says, go here, this has happened, and then you're confronted with whatever is in front of you, and you have to make decisions about how to cover it. I think to me, being an anti-racist in coverage is more about trying really hard to practice radical empathy. And, like before I used to go on stories, and a lot of the stories I covered, and I know that Marisol covered, were very challenging for us, even as women of color, to understand how someone gets in some of the situations we saw people getting into. And so for me, I tried really hard to be as empathetic as possible and non-judgmental, and let the people lead the story and not my own biases. And that's really, really hard to do because, I covered stories where I couldn't believe how people were living and how they were treating their children. But that it wasn't my role to judge, it was my role to tell. And that's really hard to do because everyone has biases. It doesn't matter what color you are, what your gender is, whether you're rich or poor. There's always something you look at that just seems completely foreign to you, and your brain starts to judge. And that's the thing I think we all need to be practicing as journalists, is empathy. And that's also of people that completely disagree with everything that you're about, is trying to figure out, why is that person in this space where they don't like immigrants, or they don't like people of color, or they are racist? And what is going through the head of, like, never say I'm not a racist. Like, that's not a language anyone should say anymore. Now it's about practicing anti-racism. And to me, the basis of that as a journalist is practicing empathy, radical empathy. It has to be radical because it can't just be like, you have to really try to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're covering and try to see things from their lens and suspend everything. They're not college graduates. They're not people that have had privilege. They're not, like, try to think, this is where this person has come from. And reading helps, you know what I mean? Read some good nonfiction that really speaks about stories about people of color and experiences that they've had, so that you can be somewhat educated when you are faced in these situations with people that you really don't understand why they're living in a tent city, or why they're living in, 5 families in one apartment, or why this person is living in their car. Why don't they just get a place to live? Or they're working at Walmart, they could get something, like, to try to really dial that back and say to yourself, okay, let me, like, with a blank slate, look at this person's story, no judgment. And my job as a journalist is to be their voice, not my voice. And it's not about Yvonne Latty, it's about this person living in this situation. And I think that if the more that we can do that as journalists, the more better our stories will be, the more impactful, and they could truly make a difference and make the world a better place, which is why I think we all are kind of doing this, because we wanna, in some like maybe Disneyland way of thinking, we just wanna make the world better, you know? And so learning to listen, learning to practice this radical empathy where we're just a vehicle to tell the truth. It's not about what we think or what we feel or what my mother told me when I was 12, you know? So that's my response to that.
No, I think that's really helpful. I'm curious, actually, this is to both of you, just kind of piggybacking on that a little bit in terms of um, radical empathy. We also, Yvonne and I, certainly having been journalists for a long time, know that journalism has not traditionally been the most diverse and inclusive place. But, you know, over the last certainly year or two, we have seen some really hard reckoning in this country and in journalism of sorts, right? Racial reckoning, particularly since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and definitely has touched journalism. And I'm curious from both of you, I'd love to talk a little bit about, you know, how are you seeing sort of that reckoning playing out in journalism, but even more specifically, playing out in housing and homelessness? Saba, you know, so much of your research obviously is in this space, really looking at how housing justice is a racial justice issue. And now I'd love to kind of dig in a little bit on that question with you on the research side, especially, but just generally what you're seeing in LA, where this is such a big issue. How is that kind of playing out? Is it being done well? Is it not? Are folks really kind of thinking about this issue as they're covering or thinking about anti-racism as they're covering homelessness and housing? I'd love to kind of get your feedback on that.
That's a good question. You know, I think I'll first speak about sort of the sector and how we've been in the homelessness sector been looking at this issue. In fact, it wasn't until it was in 2017 when I had the honor of being part of a movement within the sector that finally recognizing that homelessness is a race issue, that white supremacy and racism is a root cause of homelessness. Because like I said, in every state of the country, there's disproportionate representation of BIPOC, most particularly Black and Native American folks. And with Latinx communities, that data is not accurate. Because many Latinx communities and individuals will experience homelessness by doubling up. And we don't have a way of counting people that are doubling up. In fact, HUD doesn't even really count doubling up as a form of homelessness. And so the data is not accurate in my view, and in many other scholars' view that I've had the opportunity to know. And that movement, it comes with fits and starts, because I think even still, many organizations in the sector are mostly white-led, and the people of color are more in the positions of the frontline positions. And so it's really hard to let go of power. You know, whenever I work with organizations, I tell them, like, if you're going to do one thing, have BIPOC leadership, encourage and support people moving into power positions that are people of color. And I think a lot in 2020 during the uprisings, many organizations did come out with statements and, you know, kind of acknowledged what happened, but then may or may not have done the work internally. And I really appreciate what Yvonne was saying about sort of the interpersonal part of being an anti-racist. And it starts with you, it starts with observing your own biases. Like she said, we all have them. And then you have the interpersonal, and then you have the sort of organizational and systemic. And I think I was talking about the institutionalized racism that we see, the systemic and institutionalized racism. So many organizations spoke a big talk, but are still kind of working toward walking the walk in a way that really has made, we haven't necessarily, everyone's on a different path. And I think in our region in Los Angeles, we did have a really great effort around the ad hoc. We had an ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness that did a ton of work to amplify the needs and really worked with community members, Black community members who experience homelessness, to develop 63 recommendations on how to address Black homelessness in Los Angeles. And, I haven't, it was covered. I think the press could put more pressure on us, to be honest, about furthering those recommendations, because now our county has an anti-racist department, and we still haven't seen those recommendations being implemented. And I think generally the coverage that I've seen hasn't quite lifted up that housing is a racial issue to the extent that we really should, given that the majority of people experiencing homelessness in LA are people of color. And so kind of speaking to what I said earlier, like, okay, we need to acknowledge that, that this is a racial justice issue. And at the same time, not marginalize people further by not acknowledging the impact of historic policy, historic and current policies that haven't been able to undo, the hundreds of years of institutionalized racism.
Can you just address that one? Because I realized one of the things we didn't talk about, and Yvonne, I'm going to jump to you with the follow-up in a second, but Saba, I wanted to ask you that we didn't really talk about, like, we're saying homelessness is a racial justice issue.
Yeah.
Housing instability and housing justice is a racial justice issue.
Yeah.
What do we mean by that? Right? Like, what specifically? I mean, can you talk a little bit about the concreteness? Is that a word? Talk about sort of like how, like the concrete examples of what we mean by that.
Yeah, again, I guess I'll go back a little bit in time for us to acknowledge that the United States was founded on the land and labor theft of American Indians and Black people. So that's how we were founded as a nation. And that is displacement, right? And that theft and displacement has been institutionalized by American policy explicitly and implicitly. Some examples are the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Jim Crow, redlining, the war on drugs, and then like even the Clinton bill, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. So we have these policies that have either explicitly left, like, racially excluded Black and brown people, or have implicitly done so because and further marginalized folks. And so that's America, that is something that we haven't addressed. And it's just systems won't produce different things unless they're intentionally changed. So again, going back to the systemic and institutionalized piece. And even recently, like in 2008, with like how Black homeowners, I don't know if you guys saw the story about Black homeowners getting their having to, like, they had pictures of their family, these Black people, and in the house, and then it got assessed at a lower price, and then they, did an experiment to kind of not take those down, and then the value of the house went up. And in the work that I did in terms of access to housing was to pose as someone that is seeking to rent a unit, right? And this is work that happens all across the US. And you walk in, you pretend like you're a renter, you collect how much the rent is, da 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 da, and then next thing, a white person that looks more or less like you goes in, collects the same information. So we've had that data, and we've had that data since the housing law in 1968, and we know that Black and Brown people don't get access to housing at the same rates as white people, and so we do that every 10 years. And in the United States, home ownership is the top form of wealth building. So our communities have basically been left out of that activity. And so when we go back as early as our beginnings to now, we see that that hasn't been addressed, particularly for Black and Brown people. And now here in Los Angeles, it's like, it makes me cry to think about, now that prices are so high, like how are Black communities are ever going to be able to participate in home ownership, like on a broad scale? It just feels like, how is that even going to happen in a city like Los Angeles? So I think that's why I see that this as housing as a racial justice issue, because it's just always has been, and there hasn't been enough to kind of remedy that history.
And sometimes I wonder if there's been enough to connect how all of these things come together, because we see a lot of the stories, right, about the disproportionality, and we see what's happening to Black homeowners. We see those stories, but they
Yeah.
somehow still kind of miss a little bit of the underlying story, right? Around,
Yes.
like, there's a system at play that is not helping people to move forward, not this idea of personal narrative, personal failing that often kind of
Exactly.
plays
And
out.
I just want to add one thing to that, because I think the other thing is that not only have Black and Brown people have been like excluded from home ownership and wealth building, but white Americans have been resourced. Like all of our like early policies was really affirmative action for white folks, even like early affordable housing after the Depression. It lifted people up. And then the GI Bill is now looked on as the biggest transfer of wealth to white families in our history. And think about it, like those people that were able to buy those houses were able to send their kids to college, were able to like benefit from their mortgage. And now like those are generations that have been resourced from that. And so I just want to lift that up too, because I think coverage doesn't necessarily acknowledge that. Like there's this whole concept of, oh, well, I can lift myself up by my bootstraps, but like, how has American policy supported you to do that as like, as white people? And then not to say, that they did, people don't deserve that support, because I think they do. It's just like, I wish that it wasn't racialized. I wish everyone had the same access from the beginning.
Saba, thank you. I'm curious, Yvonne, I want to get your response or your thoughts on some of what Saba was saying, because I'm thinking about like, how are journalists bringing in those kind of connective pieces that are often rooted in history, right? So that's one. And then I would love to kind of go back to the original question for you too, about how you see journalists practicing anti-racism. Do you see journalists practicing anti-racism? In what way? So it's kind of a two-part question there for you.
Hopefully I won't forget. I mean, I think systematic racism is huge, and I don't know how you undo it. I think it's done in little tiny pieces, and
or report on it.
I don't know how. I mean, I wish I knew how to undo all that's happened or make things move forward. I think things move so slow. I think that's like Gen Z can't stand that things move so slow, and I don't know how, how, I mean, it's something I think about all the time because every system I've ever been in has been racist, there's no doubt about it, and it's like you, as a person of color working in these environments, you just try to do the best that you can. But I don't know like how I feel like Black people and brown people have been so buried in this country, and anyone who's been able to get out of the hole is like so amazing because everything is kind of stacked against you in a way. Like when I look at my own life, like how people who grew up with me and how difficult it's been. I mean, I think as journalists, it's our job to write about it and to try to include these things in every story we do, even if it's short, you know what I mean? Somehow get a plug in for the truth. And the more that you can do that, the better it'll be. But it's really hard. Like, I think about it a lot, especially like, running diversity at NYU, like how do you change the way things are? It's so complicated. Especially when you talk about things like housing and right now, like newspapers are pushing really hard, or publications really hard, websites, videos, podcasts on things about the economy, but CRT, critical race theory is really big. And you look at what's winning the Pulitzers, what are the finalists? I mean, a lot of those stories are stories that now people of color are part of the reporting teams, like in Tampa, Suave, which is about, a teenager going to jail for killing someone, getting life, and then being released. South Lake, finalist in podcasting, is about critical race theory. Invisible Child is about following a homeless child for 8 years. Nonfiction Pulitzer also was a series in the Times. So that's where I think you're starting to see and all the apologies, every newspaper is apologizing.
Philadelphia, the Inquirer.
Yeah,
right?
they're going
really
hard on
keen.
their apologies.
And a lot of their stories have been about having an anti-racist newsroom at the Philadelphia Inquirer.
They're trying, but I'm sure if you talk to Black reporters there's still a ways to go. I mean, when the first article came out about the Inquirer, a lot of the white journalists pushed back on it, especially the ones that had retired, saying, oh no, it wasn't like that. And the people that were pushing back were people that I knew who would say, I'm not racist, who would say, I'm very progressive, I'm very liberal, I'm queer, I'm this, I'm that, or the other thing, but we're the first ones saying, oh no, the Inquirer was never, just because that Black person felt bad, we also had this person and that person. So it's really hard. It's like, even when you acknowledge it, then okay. But I think step number one is acknowledging there's a problem and then actively working towards solutions. But until you acknowledge it, there is no solutions that can be enacted, really. It's just more of the same. And I think with stories about housing and the unhoused, I think, so much of what journalists do is chase news. So when you have these opportunities to do that, try to put some facts and context and history in it. Don't just, do the basics. Really try to throw something in there, because it's those little things that start to snowball. So I hope that answered.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And as you were talking about Philly, I mean, I'm thinking back to our time at the Philadelphia Daily News covering North Philly, and in the 90s when things were hard. And it was a slightly different city than it is today. And also, some of what you're talking about is making me think about, like, concretely, right? Like, what for journalists who are sitting here and watching this. Well, first of all, right? I mean, for journalists who also have to be removed to some extent, right, from the in the ground, kind of like, they're not connected in the same way to the work that advocates are doing, or researchers, et cetera, right? They hold a very different place.
Yeah.
What are some concrete ways that they can practice anti-racism in ways that they're not thinking or feeling like, wait, that I'm taking a position, right? Because that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about something different. And so I'd love both of your thoughts, both of you to, what are some concrete ways or some concrete examples? Yvonne, you were, for so many years, you ran the reporting project at NYU where you had your students doing all kinds of stories and you were practicing anti-racism with them, right? Anti-racist
Yeah.
journalism. So I'd love to kind of hear some thoughts from you on that sort of like nuts and bolts of what this means for a reporter.
I mean, it's kind of like what I said before. It's about checking your bias, practicing radical empathy, doing stories that are centered on people as opposed to what you think. Like a really big problem, I think, in J schools is just so many of the students come in thinking that it's about me, I. They just want to put in every story, my observations, like, who are you? So a lot of it is trying to be, objectivity is, yeah, but it's like, who do you choose to interview and how do you center your stories? These are really big, big parts of it.
It's really helpful. Saba, what do you think? I'd love to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts.
I just so appreciate this conversation. I mean, I thank you for saying about the empathy, Yvonne, and the radical empathy, because I think absolutely that's essential. And I think in terms of unpacking your own biases, it's also essential to have radical empathy with yourself so that you're able to like honestly observe. I know that has been part of my anti-racist practice, and for me, it's been an important and beautiful journey that is centered in love. In that, I think we're swimming in this society and in basically in white supremacy, and we have been taught things like we've been socialized around this, and white supremacy is harmful to everyone, even if you are someone that appears white. It's hurting us. And so in order to unpack that, like I said, you kind of have to start with yourself. And I know for me, definitely meditation and mindfulness practice has been center to that, so that I can really sit with myself. And I remember there's one story, and also, like, I think storytelling is, I just want to say, I appreciate all the work that everyone does, because I think storytelling in and of itself counters white supremacy. It can, because it's bringing the voices, it's calling on our humanity. And there was one time when I was like in Beverly Hills and I was walking, and I had just, in my sight, I saw a young Black man, the same age as my son now. He's probably like 18. And I just happened to kind of adjust my purse as I, for whatever reason. And this young brother, like, he took that as a cue. He took down his hoodie. He put on a big smile. He wanted, it still makes me cry. It still makes me emotional, because these are the subtle things, and if I hadn't been already interrogating, where is my internalized, anti-Blackness, then I might have missed it. And so see those moments as an opportunity, like, and put yourself in situations to practice observation and radical empathy, and how bodies show up in the space, and what the nonverbal communication that's happening, what that is. And then you can change, like, you can change your biases if you're aware of them. Like Yvonne said, like it starts with that awareness. So that's a personal practice. But I also want to say, like, around that piece is like, none of us are I think that the concept of objectivity is an element of white supremacy culture. In fact, there's a great paper by Tima Okun that lists, Okun is her last name, that lists a bunch of elements of white supremacy culture. And I invite people when I do anti-racist work with communities to look at those elements and gather in small groups and talk about how each of those elements show up in your work, in your communities, and interrogate them so that you can identify them. Because a lot of times we're focused on anti-racism, racism, but we're not focused on understanding the element white supremacy, which is the cause of racism, right? So we need to kind of have a working knowledge of how it shows up. And so I really recommend that practice for people on the call to just get together and really identify those elements.
That's thank you, Saba. I actually want to jump on something that both you and Yvonne have talked about, which is storytelling and really lifting up. Yvonne, you talked about this with your students, and Saba, you were talking about this just now, really engaging the stories of people, especially for having like the diversity of voices.
Yeah.
I really want to like, how, as a reporter, right? And you're thinking of your story, you're writing your story. What is the difference between the storytelling that you all are talking about versus having a story that then translates or becomes poverty porn, right? Like, because we've seen that. We've seen so many stories that just kind of lift up to be that poverty porn story, right? Or continues sort of the white savior story, or the one person of color who is the outlier of all outliers because they did XYZ, or yeah, I mean, we kind of have seen those tropes. So for a reporter, what does that look like, right? In terms of like, because I think reporters get that, like stories. We know stories are like key. How do we move out of that other space though, into the real thing that we're talking about here? And you all are making me think about this because
It's a
deep,
great
man. It's
question.
deep.
I think I'll take a stab at it. I think it's starting from understanding the tropes, like what the things that you just mentioned, Yvonne, like the exceptional Black person, the white savior, like understand those narratives, the mammy, the Jezebel, like even there was a story that I was looking at, I think it was in the Los Angeles Times apology, like, you guys were talking about the apologies, where they were, talking about Mexican Americans in a disparaging way that was just like, it was an older story. It was like the zoot, I can't remember what the term was that they used exactly, but these are like kind of like archetypes that have, if we look, we can find them in lots of places, and definitely in old journalistic articles. So I think it's an awareness thing to kind of understand what those racialized tropes are and interrogate your work around that, because, and I think that's why we're calling it a practice, because, it's ongoing. It's something to have an anti-racist practice. It is, you're going to do more work, but to build your consciousness, but the more you know, the more you know. And I think for me, it was really illuminating because once I kind of understood some of those archetypes, it was so easy to identify them when they came up. And so I think that's a really good place to start, is just like educating yourself.
I agree with everything you said. Those are actually really a good way to look at it. I mean, I also think it's really important to seek out media done by people of color.
Yes.
Like I know during the election, when Trump was going up against Hillary, I became addicted to In the Thick, a podcast by Latino USA, where basically people of color would sit in a circle and talk about what was going on in from a really specific perspective. And, it really helped me. Not only did it help me with what I was feeling and thinking, but it also helped me to understand what other communities, like the Native Americans and communities that maybe I'm not from, how they were thinking about it. And so I do think it's a good practice to read or listen to or seek out like podcasts or look at, The Root or any kind of media that is NBC Latino, whatever, Futuro Media and, Latino USA, that really does nothing but give communities of color voice and are done by really good journalists of color. It helps you with just perspective and understanding what this community is feeling and thinking and how they're seeing something. Like I took my students to Puerto Rico after Maria, and listening to Latino USA and listening to them talk about Puerto Rico in this really different way than major media was talking about it really helped our coverage. It really did, because, I'm not Puerto Rican. I don't have family there. I was getting a lot of my information from the New York Times, but here were, Puerto Rican journalists, Puerto Rican activists talking about what was going on ground level on the island. And it just was really informative. So I think, more and more media run and controlled by people of color. It's just real. Some of it's really well done. It's really interesting. It gives you really a micro and macro look at the community. And it doesn't take a lot of time, to like have that be part of your daily recipe, whatever community you live in, just kind of like seeking out that. Yes, and our body politic, I work for a podcast called Sounds Like Hate that just, we do stories on extremism, and we had our January 6th episode was featured in our body politic. They do a lot of really good conversation about people of color and our stories and how we look at things. Like our January 6th coverage was really framed around race. It was really specific about that. And a lot of that was because I produced it. And that was the thing I thought about the whole time was, this is like the ultimate act of like racism, what we're seeing here. All of this is based on white supremacy, nothing else but that. And so when you have reporters of color looking at things, they just see things a little bit differently. And it's not biased, it's not one-sided, it's just, they may go down a road that a white reporter won't. So I really encourage supporting diverse media and diversifying your diet, and not just going in and looking at the publication or the TV station or what have, just looking at their stuff, but look at what people of color are producing, as well as like documentary podcasts really give a lot of different perspectives on sometimes the same issue.
I think it's so important, especially around the diversity of our media, because if we just stick to mainstream media, we're going to get the same, right, media diet, and often the same perspective, because there is always a journalism lens, right? But communities of color and newsrooms that are led by people of color are going to have a very different sort of culturally informed, right, way of approaching coverage. We're getting to 10 minutes of time, and I would love to open up the chat or the Q&A to answer any of your questions. And it looks like we have a question here about, so someone wrote, I feel like a lot of journalists fail to indict capitalism as a root cause of homelessness. How the commodification of housing, a supposed human right, has led to so many housing issues. Is this something you all have noticed in coverage? How does media's failure to acknowledge that homelessness is a byproduct of capitalism hurt unhoused Black and Brown people? Will newsrooms ever allow this acknowledgement, given they operate within a capitalistic system and have a bottom line? That's deep. Okay, I'm gonna just open it up to the both of you to answer. What do you think?
I mean, I guess I'll just say that I think that a lot of times people have like a really different view of kind of like what is actually happening in newsrooms. Like you're the type of people who would do the stories on the unhoused or are not like the people that are making decisions on that level. You know what I mean? Like it's just like I can't, like in my experience, and Marisol could talk about her own, like where we had our control was when we got sent out, who are we going to interview and how are we going to frame this story? That's a lot of power. That's a lot of power. But sort of like, you know, the media and these sort of like big picture ideas, I just never really had any control over that. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a reporter, because I felt like you had so much, like how people, that if I was in the situation, if I was on the story, based on my background, I was going to tell a truth that my white counterpart wasn't going to tell, you know? And so I believe that if there's a reporter who sees this, who sees capitalism as the root cause of homelessness, if they were doing a story about it, that they could inject that in there by interviewing experts who could talk about that. I mean, because that's where we have the power, is like who we choose to interview. I mean, the media is basically run by white men with a lot of money for the most part, and they're run by these big corporations and newsrooms. The staffs are getting thinner and thinner, and people are being asked to do more and more and more. So I think for me, the way that I would, if I was in charge of a newsroom, is, you know, I would hope that I would have reporters who would be thinking about things bigger than just, oh, this bad thing happened. Let me interview the unhoused woman, get one expert, and then I'm leaving at the end of the day. I would hope that they would dig a little deep and maybe, you know, say, I want to do a project on this. But that's where that kind of conversation would come in. It would be more in a project than a one-off, or, you know, I mean, what do you think, Marisol?
No, I agree with you. And I think that for reporters that are covering this as a sort of as a beat, right? I have a really hard time thinking that any reporter or their editor said to them, don't cover homelessness as a byproduct of capitalism, right? No one's really having that conversation. I think to Yvonne's point about staffs are thin, people are just moving quickly. And I think that in general, because of the nature of how journalism operates, it's quick, it's now, it's by seconds. It's no longer like you write a story and then it shows up in the paper the next day. It's like you write a story right now. You have 30 seconds, an hour. That's a long time now to write and put it out. So what you are, or what are the person who's asking the question, you're talking more about a systemic root cause to homelessness that then, right, housing justice organizations, that sources to the reporters writing the stories, right, the researchers, the providers, the advocacy organizations, the developers, the housing justice groups, right? That's now we're having a conversation about the source. You are the sources. That's more about the sources raising this to the reporter as it relates to the story that the reporter is working on, right? Saying, you know, this thing isn't happening in a vacuum. This thing is happening because people can't afford rent. This is happening because people are not getting paid enough to afford skyrocketing rents. $10 and $15 an hour is not going to cut it. That's why people are ending up doubled up. That's why they're ending up without a home. And that the impact of that is even greater on people of color, because they're the ones that are having the problems with education, all the systemic racism thing that we've just spent, you know, 57 minutes talking about, right? So that's really on us, on the advocacy, nonprofit, housing justice side, to really point that out to reporters who I do think will be receptive, having been a long-time reporter. I think reporters are like, oh, well, that's kind of a broader context. that maybe I wasn't thinking about because I only have 45 minutes to write this thing, right? And so that's where we can kind of understanding the pressures then that reporters are also facing on the other side, I think are really important. And maybe that also gets to the second question, which is what can housing justice organizations do to ensure anti-racism is at the forefront of the everyday work, especially as it relates to censoring directly impacted people in the work. And I think that, you know, understanding from my end, at least as a reporter, understanding how understanding the needs of journalists as they're working through stories. They want stories. They want good stories. They want stories that highlight an issue. They want stories that are different, right? That are not the same thing over and over. They want to understand context and nuance. They do want to get all of that because that's important to the storytelling. And so understanding that, I think, is behooves the sources, whether you're a housing justice organization or researcher or wherever it is that you're approaching it. I think that that's important. Yvonne, Saba, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, if only it wasn't just on housing justice organizations to to kind of do this work. I mean, I wish that it was. I wish that we could look to more institutions that can really lift up that intersection of racism and housing and white supremacy. And I think, in terms of how to ensure anti-racism is at the forefront of our advocacy, I think it starts, like I said, with you and with, to the extent that you can find and build community within your place of work to hold that, because a lot of Black and Brown people are experiencing white supremacy in their workplaces, and then are also being asked to kind of lift the issue up for everyone else. And so that's something that shows up, and that's problematic. I think to the extent that there is a more organizational wide effort, and that there's real work being done around creating racially affirming environments so that people can bring their whole selves to the work. And then the other piece about having Black and Brown leadership is,
That's so important.
so essential.
I guess to Yvonne's point earlier, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And if you think about like the historic theft of wealth from our communities, that, if you're hiring and promoting and mentoring and ensuring Black leadership, then you're also Black and Brown leadership, then you're also putting money back into the communities. Like, it's like I said, if that's the only thing that you can do, then do it. If that's a one thing that you're able to do, then that's a really powerful thing. And I just really want to acknowledge Sierra's comment around imposter syndrome and empathy. And I just want to affirm you in your work, and thank you for for your comment. I think it's really important for us to think about self-care in this work as well. And I know we're at time. We could talk about this stuff forever.
We are at time, and I want to say thank you both so much to both of you. This was such a great conversation to kick off this media series, and I just am so grateful to you both for joining us. I know that we're at time, so I do want to just say very quickly that we are going to have our next webinar in the media series is June 10th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, and it is actually about a topic that Saba raised earlier, which is about how the homelessness data is not accurate and doesn't count everyone who is unhoused and all of the breadth and experience of that. So Dr. Margot Kushel at the Benioff Center Initiative, at the University of California in San Francisco, and Sam Carlson from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless will be joining us to talk about all the ways that we need to be looking at who is experiencing homelessness and why. So data, heavy, data-rich conversation at that point. Yvonne, Saba, thank you so very much for joining us today, and
Thank
we
you.
are so grateful.
Thank you.
Thank
It's been a
you.
pleasure.
And thank you
Teaching
to
you.
thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. Looking forward to more in this series. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Be well, family.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.